Right. Nothing personal.
Everything.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah. Which now I don't know. But.
Well, Sarah, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and
yeah.
start
Is it
talking?
recording already, Hannah?
It's recording already.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Sarchin. I live in Los Angeles and I'm a painter. I make mostly figurative paintings, or paintings that work in the discourse of figuration and of painting. It's sort of an open practice, but I work mostly in oil at a variety of different scales, scales that have to do with life size and sort of directly with the body. I incorporate a lot of sort of slapstick or ham-fisted content into my work that again sort of deals with the body and having a body, but also as a way of sort of thinking about and working through the history of representation, which is so sort of overburdened and brings so much baggage with it into, you know, someone who wants to be a figure painting in 2020. So yeah, should I say any more than that? I feel like we'll get into it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that gives me like a lot of things to ask about too, so that's great. Well, it's so good to meet you, Sarah. And your work is new to me, so that was fun, going down some rabbit holes online to just learn a little bit more, so I'm really happy to talk with you. I'm Nancy Zastudil. I've lived in Albuquerque for probably about 10 years now, a little bit longer. And I moved here after having lived in LA for a little while. And I was in Houston for a bit, San Francisco and Chicago, and then found my way to New Mexico. And here in Albuquerque, right now I'm working as gallery director at Tamarind Institute, which started in Los Angeles. And we're a lithography workshop and gallery. And then independently, I work as an editor for artists and their writings, their statements, publications, things like that. And have written, you know, short articles and things for a magazine out of Texas for the last several years until COVID shut us all down. Mm-hmm. So, and then here in Albuquerque also, I had a gallery space for a few years, and, you know, have just been involved in different committees and initiatives, projects and things, primarily in downtown Albuquerque, but, you know, kind of wherever artists are doing things in different groups and just different facets. I found a great, interesting press release from Grace Bench, the show that you had there last year. So that was, I spent a little time just sort of sitting with that short press release, but the way it described your writing was kind of interesting. And so I wonder if I could just kind of jump into some questions.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just pull up that press release. It's in the first sentence and it says, someone, it's not important who, around the late 60s posted that regardless of inclination, the acts of seeing or watching can be recognizable as two distinct activities, each laden with their own precepts of what the eye will do. Is that something coming from you or from the gallery?
Yeah, that came from the gallery.
Okay.
The press release was written by James Bay, who's the director of the gallery. And he, I did a big kind of, for me, ambitious chunk of writing for my thesis work when I was finishing my MFA program at UCLA. And one of the paintings from that show was included in the show at Grace Bench. And so I sort of handed him this writing that I'd done around that work. And he, I mean, it's really that thing that he wrote, the press release, was really his writing. And I was really touched by, it seemed like such a great read of the work, but it kind of pulled out some of those ideas that I'd kind of handed off to them. And they mostly, as a starting point, used this collection of paintings that I'd made of Helen Frankenthaler that were paintings done of a photo shoot that she did for, I think it was Life magazine, I can't remember the date at the moment, but it's this sort of famous photo shoot of her as this representative of this new rising force of women abstract painters coming out of New York. And it's a really iconic set of photos. One of them made it into the magazine, but then there's a whole series that that came out of the photo shoot. So I sort of used those as source images to make a series of paintings that had this kind of inscrutable quality of being kind of like cinematic, because it's like a figure that's moving across several frames, even though they were very kind of painterly paintings I produced. She's also in the photo shoot in her studio, she's sitting on her own paintings and sort of surrounded by and subsumed by her own sort of abstract canvases, which are giant and are sort of flexible because of the way she paints. So they're kind of just like draped all around her, and she's sitting on top of them. And there's, you know, this whole huge discourse about female abstract expressionists and sort of the gendered language that is attached to women making, you know, the same kind of marks and gestures as men, et cetera. And so it's just this very loaded image of her, this successful, iconic female painter, sitting demurely atop her paintings, surrounded by her paintings. And then to turn that into a painting, for me, kind of just compounded and multiplied all of that baggage in an interesting way. And so this idea that she's, you know, posing, being seen, it holds all of that kind of dialogue that's really juicy in the image, and then I turn it into a painting and I get to put into it like an additional sort of layer of observation and observed and all of that stuff. And who's the subject, what's the subject, where's the subject? Yeah, long answer.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I you know, I love all those layers kind of conceptually and just physically within that painting. And, you know, anyone that knows or has had probably even just like a cursory interest in abstract painting from that time, you know, it was very physical and they were big paintings. And to think about Frankenthaler making those big kind of gestures with her body to make that painting, to make her paintings, and then to see your painting and think about that photo where she's been posed. Yeah, just
and those paintings were they were the size of a couple works in this show. They were like 9 by 12, I think. So they're really intimate, the ones that I made. Yeah. So it kind of then, and you know, it's like I'm making a painting of her painting. It's all kind of like this corny, corny move of consolidating all this stuff together. But yeah, that's where that kind of language came out of, I think, of the who sees and who's seeing.
Right. No, it's
and I think, yeah, something about like the figure that knows it's being looked at. And I mean, that's such a interesting through line, I think, in the history of painting.
Absolutely. And within that history, when you're recreating is not the right word here, but when you are making paintings that are borrowing from these more historical compositions, especially of the female nude, I mean, you're not just recreating those pieces or those compositions. You're not, you know, it's not a copy of those paintings. So can you tell me more about what you're bringing to that and how you are not only inserting yourself, but bringing, you know, more contemporary history almost, you know, the contemporary moment into those paintings, and even kind of the gaps between, you know, when the original painting was made and now. How are you working through all of that and bringing it into being in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of an open question. That's the move I'm kind of interested in, is creating a question. And there was this other sort of touchstone I had been working with a lot when I was making those Helen Frankenthaler paintings. It was sort of part of this larger constellation of things I was thinking about. And one of them was this crouching Venus figure from antiquity, Greek and then Roman, but this sculpture, like many sculptures, that is sort of like an iconic touchstone of art history, but that part of its meaning derives from its replication, that it had been, there was an original that was Greek, that we think existed. And we think it existed because of the just huge, enormous, endless kind of parade of copies that exist of it and across several moments in time. And so thinking about a subject as something that, I don't know, like I could kind of get into a parade of people who have and will continue to use something that just, for a variety of reasons, just holds a lot of material that you can work with and manipulate. And so there's kind of like a relinquishing of authorship that I think is really productive and like fun to play around with when you're adopting some source material as like an armature. It kind of lets you off the hook in some ways. And also, it also gives you sort of like more of a direct, how would you, like, I don't know, like on the ground, maybe kind of like connection to something from a different historical moment or from multiple moments in history. If you're just actually, you know, like we look at art and you look at it and it kind of collapses the time between you and its production. And so looking at something that's been kind of repeated, this particular sculpture repeated as a sculpture, and then it's been incorporated into paintings innumerable times. The pose shows up over and over again. It's just kind of a highly functional image. So I realized like, oh yeah, I, like everybody else, can just kind of repurpose this and see what I can use it for or what I can make it for, and also potentially kind of just like submit to it and see what the big deal is. Yeah.
Well, and you also, it's not just historical figures or, you know, images that you're looking at, right? You're also looking at memes and more contemporary pop culture things.
Yeah.
How are you sifting through all of those, you know, just the onslaught of images that we have now? How are you picking and choosing what's jumping out at you?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think there's kind of like a variety of like research kind of rabbit holes that happen sort of naturally. There was, I started working with images of Brigitte Bardot a couple of years ago, which I mean is honestly kind of random, but it sort of came out of this research, again, following that sculpture and thinking about ideas of portraiture versus generalized representations of figure. Like this is a very general figure here.
I'd like to come back to that one, by the way.
We can.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's, yeah, the sort of distinction between something that's like an aspirational or a common figure versus a particular precise representation of an individual person. That's a whole kind of
recognizable
yeah,
identity that way. Okay.
Yeah, and I think there is something really, I think like the aspirational figure is really like has been productive for me to work with and think about at various points, because it's so, I mean, you see like classicism becomes popular over and over again at moments of extreme sort of conservative, like the Nazis, like, you know, there's these times where it takes up more space because there's this larger notion of, you know, an idealized human form being something that we should all be concerned about and working towards, which, yeah, is like obviously hugely dangerous. So, and problematic and gross. So kind of, well, I'm trying to remember where this question started.
Oh, this one was about how are you sort of culling your images from pop culture? How are you picking and choosing what ones to think about, you know, in terms of your work?
Oh, right. So yeah, thinking about like this sort of line between a generalized figure and a specific figure, and knowing that this kind of a generalized representation of a figure can become very kind of problematic is the, yeah, it can be a problem. But then a specific representation of a portrait, like that's not something I'm necessarily interested in. I mean, it can be really wonderful to produce a portrait, to make a painting be really satisfying in and of itself, but that kind of loaded problematic question of an ideal sort of human figure that keeps popping up again throughout the history of painting and art history is what I kind of wanted to be able to grapple with. And I was researching, I mean, in the most kind of like armchair way, some stuff about the French Revolution when Trump got elected in 2016, kind of trying to find a lens to think about painting in that, you know, this ongoing time that we're in, and found this figure of, I don't speak French, so this is just going to be a ridiculous part of our conversation, but of Marianne, who is like this idealized French woman who became symbolic for the revolution. And it was sort of this weird moment of like an idealized female figure, which was derived from this sort of Greek and Roman classical imagery, but kind of represented this more specific populist movement. And then I found this thing where like Brigitte Bardot had been cast as that figure at some point in her career. She became like this generalized female figure to represent all French, the ideal French woman, but it was Brigitte Bardot who was like the sex pot Hollywood star. So it was like this weird conflation of this like of all of these ideas in this figure of her. And then I started kind of just looking at images of her, and she's just such a kind of bizarre figure of her own. And there's so many really incredible pictures of her. I started painting pictures of her in Picasso's studio, again, like a photo shoot for a magazine. So these kind of incredible, strange pictures that only make sense from this strange sort of mass consumer cultural standpoint. Because she was like, I don't know, she looks like she was maybe 20 and he's much older. It's like these two people should be in a room together looking at paintings like that.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. And they should be posing. She should be leaning over him. It was just like, so it all like this, the images come through some sort of weird, you know, very almost like stream of consciousness kind of research process. But then I think, you know, when you're painting, it all sort of comes back to what actually works on the canvas and what actually works materially. So I have like stacks of printouts of images that I kind of move through and try to make paintings out of, and then sometimes something sticks. So it really then, like what becomes a painting ends up being what there's some sort of you know, potential or possibility for the image to exist as a painting and have it produce something new and different than it does as just an image.
Sure. And can you talk to me a little bit about your painting style? You know, it's for folks that are listening, you know, they can obviously search and see more examples, and then we have the one behind you. But yeah, talk me through your painting style and your approach to that material, how you use it, you know, specifically in relation to these figures, to faces, to that kind of representation.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have a very heavy hand, I think. I like to kind of get a lot of material going on the canvas, and I think this is something I've come to really only in the last couple of years, is that I'm kind of looking for, again, an image that works as a painting in a way that it can only work as a painting, or where the painting is, I don't know, it's necessary that it's paint for it to be. So what that has turned into is kind of heavy paint application, like a lot of mixing kind of on the canvas, like color mixing on the canvas. A lot of that, you know, oil painters talk about making mud, but kind of trying to really go to that edge of a painting being just about mud, and then it's time to stop.
That's the sweet spot, yeah.
But I think it's kind of, I mean, yeah, it's very material. I like to kind of push the stuff around, and hopefully, I mean, what I find really satisfying is when I'm able to make a painting that, you know, you can really see a brushstroke, you can see the paint in a really clear way, but it also functions descriptively, if that makes sense.
It does to me, but is there an example you can give? I don't know if you can without visuals, but.
I think there's one painting in the show, Hannah included a painting of flowers, like basically a still life of flowers. And those were kind of, that was after I finished grad school and was going through a period where I kind of was trying to reacquaint myself with painting in a way. I think this thing that sometimes happens where I don't know, I got really good at sort of describing my work, and then at some point your work starts to follow the description rather than, I mean, which for some people that's fine, you know, it depends on whatever your practice is, but for me it's really important that the discoveries happen in a material way, and then the description comes after, or the sort of explanation presents itself without overburdening the process of figuring out the painting. So anyway, I started just making these still lifes of flowers, the most kind of benign kind of genre thing to do. But it worked because it was, you know, I could just buy flowers and make paintings, and it gave me just kind of an easy structure to try and just move paint around. And then you know, some of them I was really happy with, and that was sort of, at that point I realized that, oh, it's great when I can put down, I mean, this is like very basic stuff, but you know, you have to, I think, rediscover for yourself over and over again. Absolutely. When you're working with the material. But it was like, oh, I can put down one brush stroke and it's this flower petal, and then I can put down this other color right here and it's a shadow. And I've discovered something incredible. But so having that kind of satisfaction of, you know, a real like economy of movements. And I think there's also, what that's turned into is there's something that feels a little bit like accessible or honest or just kind of open when you can really see how a painting is made. Mm-hmm. And that's something that since that kind of discovery I've realized is really important to me, is that you can just see what's going on, and it's all sort of, I mean, on the surface obviously, but I think it then allows, there's kind of like a disarming process that allows some more goofy or complicated content to kind of exist and feel accessible.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I like thinking about the still life paintings. I was seeing some of those online, just searching for your work. And I mean, even the genre of still life, or, you know, the vase of flowers, like, as you were saying, that the meaning comes from its repetition, you know, with this Greek figure and things like that. It seems like that's so present in still life painting as well. You know, the importance of that presentation or representation is maybe solely because it's been done over and over and over. It's something that so many artists will return to. And it's nice to hear you talk about that economy of movement and use of materials, and like rediscovering what one brushstroke can do and what that can signify, what that can represent. I think that's always nice to hear from artists, because I studied painting and drawing in undergrad, and like never got to that point where I was like continually falling in love with the process, or like continually rediscovering. It seems like such an important thing to be finding in your work over and over and over.
Yeah, I think I mean, I started from, I think I used to be more of a perfectionist, and kind of, I got a lot of training in this really fussy, particular way of approaching representation. And I think a lot of my practice has been kind of trying to pull out of that and see what's actually necessary, and also kind of be more thoughtful about what all that stuff actually means. Because in painting, I mean, painting is it's such a huge field, but it's also so, like, it's so old.
Right.
So old. And it's got so much, it's so conservative, and has so many different kinds of conservative, you know, all different kinds of schools of conservative discourse, all inside of painting. And there's also, you know, it's got everything, but I think there's, again, it's kind of like you have to submit to it at some point. Like, okay, I'm gonna do the still lifes. Right. I've been painting for years, but now I can't talk my way out of it. I have to do them, and then
Right. Well, and it's just in looking at your work, I like to know from artists, like when I look at your work, I'm seeing it, you know, in a lot of conversation with other painters of the figure who I think are really doing interesting things. Nicole Eisenman, I mean, even Catherine Bradford. I don't know if you know Danielle Orchard's work, but she also is borrowing from modernist painting in very overt ways, but inserting, I say herself, it's not always self-portrait, but smoking, drinking, like the figure is doing her own thing within this space. She's kind of pushing at the boundaries. And I love when I see artists, you know, coming at these issues, especially of female representation and the nude form, you know, in ways that are constantly surprising, and always challenging how it's come before, you know, what the representation has been before, and even what a female body looks like now, what's identified as female, who is identifying as female, you know, and how that kind of engendered body is presented. I think that that is such a rich and important subject matter for painters, especially, like you're saying, because of the history of painting, kind of where it's come from, where it's been, you know, to see different ways of handling, like physically handling and visually handling the body. And, you know, those are just three women that come to mind that, you know, I love seeing what they're doing, and the kinds of figures that they're bringing to the forefront. And again, like how they're handling that material on the surface, and you know, deeper meanings, like, and all the sort of metaphorical associations within that phrase, you know. And so I was really excited to see your work when Hannah gave me your name. So and I'm just gonna like go right into that painting behind you and ask for you to tell us about that, in terms of, you know, figure representation, what we're looking at, who we're looking at, you know, what are they looking at, all these kind of things we're talking about, seeing and watching and looking.
What are they looking at? Oh my God. I think that's so, I'm just thinking now about Nicole Eisenman. She was someone who was so important when I kind of was trying to start making paintings. I always knew I wanted to make figurative paintings, but I didn't really start doing it until I was in my 20s after college, and kind of took me a while to figure out that was possible in contemporary art. And she was one of those kind of early, and for me, people that I found and sort of started to see, you know, that there is a conversation and that it's possible. It's not just like portrait commissions or something, if you want to do this. So, but she also is someone who, I think she sort of put out this roadmap for the variety of approaches. I mean, still, she's so like restless in her approach to making work, and the medium, the way that what her paintings look like, it's just, there's something that it was important for me at some point to kind of realize, was that it was okay to make a painting that's kind of looks bad.
Whatever that.
And this, I mean, this isn't about Nicole Eisenman anymore, but there's sort of like a, that it's not refined or highly finished, that it can be like loose and open, but still descriptive, that it can be, I don't know, there can be a way of being like tender and loving in a representation that doesn't mean like many tiny brush strokes all disappearing into a surface.
Hyper rendering.
Yeah, but there's, I mean, you can kind of make a dumb painting that still feels like deeply, I don't know, moving, maybe because of its dumbness or something. But, and like, this is a dumb painting, I think, not to be too self-deprecating, but this, I've been making, I had a few different motifs going, and there's another one in the show that is kind of floating head in front of a brick background. And again, I'm in Los Angeles, and I'm not from here, but I moved here, I think almost 8 years ago. And it's such I'm from Seattle, which is very different. And Los Angeles has such a strange kind of look and vibe if you're, you know, not from here. And that started to I started to think about incorporating these surfaces, or like these ubiquitous Los Angeles surfaces that have to do with when LA was built, you know, the history of modernism, the history of, you know, the West in the United States, and this kind of, what's this called? I can't remember it. Flagstone? This kind of like stone surface. Yeah. It was everywhere, because it was like, I mean, now we're going through this moment again of insane development. There's these disgusting condos everywhere that all look the same. And at some point this was everywhere and all looked the same, was disgusting. And so, but anyway, thinking about these kinds of surfaces that are flat, but still have some like bas relief level of depth to them, like a brick wall or the stone wall. And thinking about depicting something in paint that is, it's a painting of a thing that is flat, that's also abstract. I mean, like I could say that this is like I don't know, this is some kind of abstraction, like a brick painting is some sort of like hard edge geometric abstraction, but it's also brick. So it sort of straddles this line of being a representation or being an abstract painting, or at least sort of gesturing towards abstraction. But then it's also a depiction of something that I know is flat, and a painting is flat. But then this, I was sort of like troweling on to make this gross striated kind of stone, really like goofy, not well rendered stone faux finishing. So there's all of these ways that it is flat, it's not flat, it's a picture, it's not a picture, it's a representation, it's abstract. And then I started kind of pulling figures out of those backgrounds. So like this figure, I just troweled on a bunch of terribly faux finished stones, and then started painting a figure, and just kind of the palette that already existed produced the flesh tone. So there's this way that, and I think with all of these things, it's, you know, it's clear I'm just kind of really enjoying playing with these very sort of monolithic painting 101 ideas, right? Like in here, the figure ground and the front and the back and all of that stuff. So the figure is sort of produced from the ground. It's like entrenched in the ground. It's inscribed in the ground because it's like moving around paint that was a rock. And then I got interested in sort of like what could happen with these sort of the mortar, if the mortar's like intercutting the rocks, and then what if it was a thong underwear that would be, it didn't quite work the way I had this idea that somehow the body would be like as yeah, so the thong, I mean this, yeah, very racy painting. I think so the thong, maybe I'll just go back for a second.
Yeah, I think you were talking about the mortar when we sort of broke off.
Yeah, I made this other, there were a couple other paintings that came before this one of this sort of ubiquitous modernist rock wall kind of thing that incorporated other kind of figurative things. And then like I made a few that had, like I would put in little drop shadows and make it really like sexy and like this really satisfying kind of trompe l'oeil surface. But then at some point I felt like that wasn't really the point. The point was just this kind of weird, the kind of poorly executed, I recognize that version of this ubiquitous surface. And then putting in the mortar, I kind of like scrape on all of the rock sections and then pile on a bunch of paint while it's all still wet to make the mortar. And it started to feel like, rather than representation, like rather than a real trompe l'oeil kind of experience, it was like this kind of flattening net over the surface, which again sort of incorporates all of these juicy ideas about painting and the flatness of the canvas and the grid and whatever. So yeah, I then had this, I probably saw someone in a thong. I'm guessing that's what happened. And I was like,
that's it.
The grid, the grid on the body or something. But I just was like, oh, okay, there's like the same scale line that I can inscribe the figure itself with and somehow treat the figure in the same way that the background's being treated. And it's sort of like, I mean, this is also in this painting, it's this very cropped kind of ridiculous portion of the figure. So it's already kind of being, you know, the figure's being treated in a certain way. But then, yeah, having this sort of thong material that inscribes the figure the same way as the background's being inscribed, it sort of, again, conflates that sort of figure groundness of the painting. But it also, I feel like it kind of, like it's a, what's the word, like taking advantage of, like it's a, whatever, it's a sexy picture of a butt. But it's also because it's so kind of goofy the way it's painted. It has this kind of tenderness to it, in addition to being really kind of blatant, maybe.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and as you're talking, this is like, this shows sort of where my brain is and our experiences over the last several months. But as you're talking about that morphine of figure ground, I can't help but think of like the format that we're in right now, Zoom, and how some people create those backgrounds, like the digital virtual background to have on, and like their hair and their face like kind of move in and out of whatever virtual background they have on. And I just, you know, the sort of situation that a lot of us are in where we're not having human contact, we're also not having, you know, contact with a lot of the places and the objects and just the spaces, you know, that whether we've been accustomed to them or whether they were a treat, you know, or a highlight in our lives, they're just not accessible like they were before.
Right. Yeah, it's funny doing this, obviously in this format, but doing it at all, I'm kind of, I feel like slightly like I'm desocialized.
Right.
How do I talk to someone? But it is, I've been, I mean, I've been fortunate. I've been working a lot. I've been teaching painting, which that's kind of been the thing that's been the most, because it's been really consuming, figuring out how to make that work. So that's really kind of where all of my thinking about painting has been sitting these last few months. So I was teaching painting classes in the spring, and we had to transition online, and it was just very intense. And I'm going to be teaching again coming right up this fall, and was doing teaching this summer. And so it's very, that's kind of a separate, its own separate crisis. But it's been really interesting, sort of, you know, it's an absurd concession to teach painting online. It's an embarrassment. And yet it also feels like, because of this situation that we're all in, that really is pretty, I mean, it's awful. And so it feels like in some ways a service to be able to try and keep this conversation going, even in this incredibly kind of, you know, reduced, anemic format. But it's, and it's hard because I think, it's so important that painting and any kind of like material project, like cooking or whatever, has to be kind of approached with some space outside of language for it to really reach any kind of potential. But so having to like talk to students or having this conversation where we're all like looking really close at our screens, you know, sort of like simulating and performing the experience of close looking at something that is, you know, a physical object. Yeah, it's a weird time.
Well, and you know, I like just sort of building off that of like the lack of human contact. I mean, or like even I won't say the lack of conversation, but the sort of the change in the way we're talking to each other. Even I realized I should be talking to people more just to keep my brain active, because I was having a conversation with a fellow curator and a friend the other day, and I was like lamenting the whole, you know, Zoom situation, but more so the increase of these, you know, virtual exhibition tours and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, what other time have we had to experience painting through another medium? And I was like incensed that like this is happening, right? And she was like, well, Nancy, photography, you know. She's like, and I was like, oh, right, forgot about that moment of art history where people were, you know, obviously very different sort of societal, political situations, but, or, you know, the context, but you know, in early days of photography, people were like up in arms, some people, that we would be experiencing painting, sculpture, other forms of art through this other medium of photography. But now it's like, I would rather look at a book probably than an online exhibition, but it gave me this sort of demented bit of hope that
Right.
you know, we'll find our way through this new way of looking.
Right.
Not quite hopeful just yet, but like it gave me a little glimmer, you know,
Yeah.
and it's, and just, you know, thinking about how we started out talking about, you know, looking and watching and seeing, it's changing,
It
you know,
is.
in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think there's the internet is so bad for painting. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing teaching because I can just like Google something I'm talking to the student about and just put it right in front of their eyes immediately, that's really kind of powerful, incredible, but in front of my own eyes. But but it, you know, things look different on a screen than in person, and yeah, it's a different thing to make a painting that looks good through a mediated representation than in person. But I also, I mean, the other side of that is that it's so, like, there's so much romance around painting and around the hand and the gesture and all of this shit. And I just like, yeah, it feels harder than ever not to kind of be subsumed by that, you know, romantic sort of idea that I have some personal friction with.
Sure.
But yeah, when I go to the studio, I'm like, oh, put the paint on the canvas.
Alone in my studio.
Yeah.
It's bringing up all these things I feel like some artists and curators even have been working against for years, this like you know, the idea of the isolated artist.
Yeah.
Stuff, you know, separate from what's happening in the world. But it's a, you know, it's a strange moment where we're all separated, but we're together in that kind of separation. So
I think it's also really, it's so, I mean, some art is political and is so important, but it's also like, you know, it's hard to make your practice reactive or like in a really like fast, make it reactive in a quick way if it's a slow practice. And I think there's just, it's been too much change to process, you know, in kind of every category in the last 6 months. So it also feels kind of, you know, indulgent and dumb. I've been like, when I go to the studio, more than anything, like stretching new canvases, gessoing. I've been gessoing a lot.
Gessoing, yeah.
Like something will come out of this.
I know, something will, yeah. Well, and the internet, life on the internet moves so fast. Yeah, so to think about making a painting, it's, you know, it's just different. I would love to jump forward maybe 5 years or so and be able to look back and kind of see, you know, what we've learned and what artists have kind of gleaned and you know, contributed. But we'll wait and see.
I think, yeah, I wonder what in LA it seems like there's, and I think this is probably just part of a much larger story, but there's also, it seems like the middle might start to be falling out a little bit with the art, kind of the art world in general. This was already happening like aggressively 6 months ago. There's a lot of sort of consolidation at the top, and and there's kind of, I mean, LA has been such an incredible place for art for so long, for so many reasons, and it kind of feels like we're losing the whole chunk, like the middle part for all of the, I don't know.
The center cannot hold.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, we'll see. I'm really interested to see where that's at in 5 years.
Sure. Totally. Me too.
But what about Albuquerque?
You know, Albuquerque it's such an interesting place for art making and art exhibiting. And I'll just speak, you know, in this part, at least, to the visual arts. That's the sort of area I have the most experience with. But, you know, we don't have a strong, the arts market here has always been, you know, a little tenuous, a little unsure, unsteady maybe. But the community support around arts making is incredible. And, you know, we have the sort of exhibition spaces, there's not a ton, but the ones that we do have are so dedicated and so supportive of the artists that it is, and this is echoing around the world, but it is heartbreaking to be questioning if those spaces can open again. And when we can be in the same space, you know, share, you know, looking at the same thing. I mean, it's such a, it's so much something that I took for granted before. And now, you know, our art spaces are starting to reopen again, similarly across the country, but, you know, where I work, we have chosen not to reopen just yet. Our gallery space is very small. And we really, you know, we rely on that close person-to-person experience with a print, like to get, and we print lithography, so it's like it's collaborative, like we're at the press, we're printing, like there's no social distance. I mean, we have to, you know, put social distancing into that, but the thing, you know, for me personally is it's made me rethink completely how I access art, and how that access is available to other people. You know, in what forms. The online situation, that's great, but it's like, I'm not convinced that that is an access point that's equitable. You know, a lot of it aligns right now with me, for me, with education, and just the kinds of, you know, a lot of the artists here are also educators, so those kinds of things right now are kind of inseparable to me. And so, you know, just trying to understand how we can support artists, if it's perhaps not by buying work or showing up for exhibition openings, like how are we showing up in that way?
Well, and there's also this larger conversation about equity going on, and it's kind of hopefully productive in the long run, that you know, we're having to go through this reset of physical spaces and access, and have that conversation happening at the same time. It's pretty exciting.
Right.
And it is sort of, I mean, I don't know, I'm not gonna like glamorize quarantine, but it is, yeah, it's good to have a little bit of extra time. I think a lot of people who are teaching are, you know, kind of auditing their canon of artists, and
Totally.
you know, it feels like I mean, it feels like kind of a gift to have that mandate and have this, you know, there's enough pressure to kind of really do that, which was exciting.
Exactly. I totally agree.